Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Mark Brandon. I'm Vice President of the Board of the Princeton Adult School, and it's really my great pleasure and honor tonight to introduce our speaker, Professor Edward Felten. Professor Felten, I've heard talk at numerous times in other venues, and I know that you will all be in for a great treat. He gives a wonderful lecture, and in fact, not only will you hear a great lecture, I'm sure, tonight, but at the end of this course, we will tell you a little bit about next semester's plans, which are still in process. But I'm happy to tell you that Professor Felten is going to be coming back next semester. He's agreed to our invitation for a completely different type of lecture series next semester. But anyway, let me tell you that we are hoping that we won't have any more inclement weather. We're now in spring, so happy spring, everybody. And I'm not going to go over the school closings or the cancellation policy yet another time. Professor Felten received his BS in physics with honors at California Institute of Technology in 1985, and then went to study at the University of Washington, where he received both his MS and his PhD in computer science and engineering at the University of Washington. He came, I think, directly to Princeton in 1993, and so for 17 years we here have been very fortunate in having his expertise and advice on the faculty. And he's moved rapidly up through all of the various academic positions, and I note in that he became a full professor of computer science here in 2003, and only 3 years later he was given the honor of being a professor not only in computer science but also in public affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School. So he holds dual appointments. As I mentioned, he has these two appointments, but he is also the founding director of Princeton's Center for Information Technology Policy. His research interests include computer security and privacy, especially relating to media and consumer products, and technology, law, and policy. And perhaps many of you here have already heard Professor Felten talk on one of the topics that I've heard him talk about, and that was the computer security of voting machines that has hit the New Jersey state courts extensively over the course of the last couple of years. He's published about 80 papers in research literature and 2 books. And I have a very long CV, which I won't go over any further because we want to get right to his talk. As I mentioned, his research is on topics such as web security, copyright, and copy protection, and electronic voting has been covered extensively in the popular press. He was the lead computer science expert witness for the Department of Justice in the Microsoft antitrust case, and he testified in other important lawsuits. He testified before the Senate Commerce Committee on digital television technology and regulation, and before the House Administration Committee on electronic voting. And 6 years ago, the Scientific American magazine named him to its list of 50 worldwide science and technology leaders. Tonight's topic is cryptography, secret coding, spying, and e-commerce. Please join me in welcoming Professor Edward Felten.
Thanks. Before I start the lecture, I hope you forgive me for a brief advertisement for the Center for Information Technology Policy here at Princeton. This is a joint venture between the Engineering School and the Woodrow Wilson School that tries to bring people together to talk about the intersection between digital technologies such as computers and the internet and public policy and public life on the other hand. We have events roughly weekly, which are open to the public, and we think they're pretty interesting. So if you'd like to get on our mailing list, please come and talk to me afterward. We'd love to see some of you at our events, although if you all show up, we might have a problem. Okay, on with the lecture proper. I do a lot of work teaching and writing about computer security and about cryptography. And this is a topic I find to be really fascinating. And the reason basically has to do with the two different faces that cryptography has. On the one hand, cryptography is a technical topic. Cryptography involves mathematics and precision and reasoning and proof. And the mathematics and the techniques are quite sophisticated and subtle and elegant. And so one side of my brain really likes that. It's great engineering and science. The other side of cryptography is the cloak and dagger. Trying to break someone's code, deception, and underhanded methods, keeping secrets, passing secrets. It's interesting, and there are a great many historical stories, a few of which I'll be able to tell you tonight, around cryptography. So what I love about it is that it's both geeky and precise on the one hand, but also just a lot of fun. All right, so, and I hope you'll feel the same way by the time I'm done. Okay, so let's talk about why we need cryptography. In the old days, before computers were everywhere, we often relied on physical barriers to keep things secure. We'd have closed doors. We'd have guards, people with guns standing at the door, gates, fences. You had to show ID cards. Someone had to look you in the eye and decide you looked like you were honest and respectable. You had to be wearing the right uniform or have the right physical credential. Your papers had to be in order. But nowadays, we need another approach when we're interacting with people at a distance and electronically. A retailer, a bricks and mortar bookstore can make sure that their materials don't fly out the door by watching what goes through the door. And you can make sure that your credit card number is not whisked off into the ether by watching what the clerk does. But if you're interacting at a distance electronically, those sorts of physical means don't work anymore because your communication, your interaction is crossing many of those boundaries. You need something to stand in for the physical security, and often what it is cryptography. So cryptography stands in for physical security in the electronic world. And so the more we move to the electronic world, the more cryptography becomes important to secure our privacy and to secure our property and to make sure that we can have fair and honest interactions with people on the internet. Okay, so that's why we need cryptography. Let me talk a little bit about how cryptography works. The starting point for cryptography is a story about secret communication. You can imagine two people who are conventionally called Alice and Bob. And Alice has great urgency about something in this picture. She has some message that she wants to communicate to Bob, something that she wants to tell him to do. But the problem is that we have, there's a gap in between them through which this message has to pass. You can think of the message as being carried by an untrustworthy messenger, or as being carried by a trustworthy messenger through a dangerous forest, or passing through a network which Alice and Bob just don't know whether to trust. In any case, there's this gulf in between them, and they want to get the message across without revealing the message to anyone in the middle who might be causing trouble. So here's what they do. Alice takes her message, and she puts it into an operation. She's going to encrypt the message. She's going to take the message in what we call plain text. That is just the message written out so you could read it, and she's going to change its form. She's going to encrypt it. She's going to take the encrypted message, which is depicted here in this sort of dashed form, which I hope you can see. Having encrypted the message, changed it into a form which is going to be unintelligible to an eavesdropper, she sends it across to Bob. Bob then decrypts the message. That is, he sort of unwraps the whatever the confusing stuff is. He undoes the confusing stuff that Alice did to the message in order to get back the original plain text message, the same message that Alice meant to send. All right, so encryption for secrecy here involves encryption to put the message into code and decryption to take it out. All right, now, but there's a bit, if we think carefully about this, there's a bit of a problem. The problem is that Bob needs to be able to decrypt the message. So this step of decryption is something that Bob has to know how to do, but a would-be eavesdropper has to be unable to do the decryption step that Bob can do. So it stands to reason that there must be something that Bob knows that the eavesdropper doesn't know. An eavesdropper who knows everything that Bob knows can do everything that Bob can do and do the decryption himself. So there's got to be a secret that Bob knows, and maybe Alice knows too, and that secret is a key. A secret key, think of it as a secret password, a secret number that only Alice and Bob know. And so what encryption is going to do is it's going to take the message that Alice wants to send and somehow, with a key, scramble it up into a form that will be unintelligible except to someone who knows the key on the other side. That's the essence of what we're trying to do in encryption for secrecy. But let's dig into this a little bit more and think about what is in this encryption box and what it's supposed to be doing. So to get a little bit more precise, let's talk about a little bit about the mathematics behind this. Encryption functions, or ciphers. Right? So this is, again, a box which is a mathematical function. And if you haven't taken math recently, a mathematical function is just a kind of fixed procedure which takes, in this case, two numbers in, and according to some fixed rule, does some manipulations on those numbers to produce one number coming out. And when we say it's a function, so first of all, you give it an input, or in this case, two inputs, a message and a key, and it gives back some output. It produces some result when you put in those numbers and turn the crank. And because it's a function, when you provide the same inputs, you're going to get the same outputs later. So if Alice wants to encrypt the same message with the same key, she'll get the same encrypted message. And of course, this has to be relatively easy to compute. So it's some kind of math that we're going to do. Now, I did an implicit step here, which I should actually stop and talk about. We were talking about messages, words, on the previous slide, and now I'm talking about numbers. Well, it turns out that words and numbers are equivalent in some sense. We're operating here on a digital computer or on a digital network like the internet. And when we say digital, all we mean is that whatever information we were interested in, whether it's words or a picture or a movie or something, we have translated it into digits, digital form, hence a number. So what we want is a procedure that operates on numbers in this way. Okay, so it has to be a mathematical function, but not just any function will do. It has to be one that's going to make the message impossible or really hard for that eavesdropper in the middle to understand. So what does that mean to get a little bit more precise? Well, to get a little bit more precise, what we want is what we call a strong encryption function. And there are two properties that we want this to have. First of all, that no one who sees the encrypted message can figure out anything about the initial message. That is, this encrypted message has to just look like garbage to anyone who sees it, unless they know the key. The key is going to be the secret, the key that will unlock the message, but only to someone who knows it. Right? So the encrypted message should be unintelligible to you if you don't know the key. And the other property that we need is that somebody who can watch this function in operation, if they can watch the message go in and the encrypted message come out, they can't figure out what the key is. Why is that important? Well, in practice, often an eavesdropper might be able to guess what message Alice is going to send. So if I know that Alice is going to send the message good morning, and then I see some encrypted message go past, as an eavesdropper, then I know that Alice is going to send the message, let's have lunch, later in the day, and I see an encrypted message go by. I've now seen this function in operation. I know what Alice put in. I know what she got out, except for the key. And so it had better be the case that having seen that for a while, I can't figure out what the key is. Because if I could figure out the key from that, then I would have various devious ways to defeat Alice and Bob. And there's lots of great stories about this, some of those later. Okay, so what we want is a strong encryption function which will have these properties. And we can look at particular functions and see whether they have this property. So let's look at a weak encryption function. And I'd like you to help me try to break this encryption function. That is, I'm going to tell you what goes in and what comes out. And your goal, our goal, is going to be to figure out what the secret function is. All right, so I put in 1, and I get out 4. I put in 7, and I get out 10. Put in 724 and get out 727. All right, plus 3. Right, the function is add 3. Sure enough, well, congratulations, you have broken your first code. Now, this code actually is, I didn't just choose this one by accident. This code actually has historical significance. This code, the code of adding 3, is called the Caesar cipher because it was actually used by Julius Caesar, according to Roman historians. This is the code that Caesar used for his military communications. And according to legend or tradition, Caesar actually invented this himself or possibly reinvented it. Now, as you can see, this isn't the greatest cipher in the world. We were able to break it pretty quickly. But for the time, it was state of the art. Of course, nobody would actually use this today. This cipher is, in fact, weaker than what you get on the secret decoder ring that you might have gotten in a box of Cracker Jacks. Nonetheless, there, in fact, are people who use it today. This is Bernardo the Tractor Provenzano. He was one of the heads of the Sicilian Mafia until he was arrested in 2006. And Bernardo the Tractor's big mistake was using the Caesar cipher for his criminal conspiracy messages. What can you say? So encryption has improved over the last 2,000 or so years, but I guess fortunately for law-abiding people of Italy, Bernardo the Tractor didn't get the word. In the 20th century, cryptography was much stronger. Oh, by the way, it's worth noting that not only is this weaker than what you get on the secret decoder ring, it's also weaker than what you see in the cryptogram puzzles that you sometimes see in newspapers. I don't know if some of you have probably done those, and they apply methods of breaking encryption, which were state of the art as of, say, 1800. In the 20th century, encryption was extremely important, especially in military conflicts. There are wonderful, interesting stories from World War II. And let me tell you just one or two of them. This is called an Enigma cipher machine. This was used by the German Army and Navy in World War II. And let me talk a little bit about what this is. This is about the size of an old mechanical typewriter. And there are buttons here, keys like typewriter keys, with a letter written on each one. And what you would do as the operator is you would push the button for the next letter in your message up here, and then up on the top here, one of these letters would light up. And you would write that down on your message pad. Then you would press the key for the next letter in your message, and another light would light up, and you'd write that down. And in the end, you take this sequence of letters that you had written down, and you'd transmit them over the radio to somebody else. They would then use their machine, sort of put in decryption mode, to do the same thing. They would type in the letters that they received from you, which just look like randomish letters, and one at a time, and these letters would light up one at a time. They'd write down what was there, and the result would be the same as your initial message. So how did this work? Well, it had a bunch of pieces. Down here, there was a sort of plug board, like an old-fashioned telephone switchboard, where you could plug together various different you had plugs that were in pairs on the ends of wires, and you'd plug them in various places. Up here, there are big wheels, kind of like the wheels on a traditional car odometer. And those wheels would actually turn. Every time you pushed a button to encrypt a letter, those wheels would turn odometer style. The one on the right would advance one slot, and once it had gone all the way around, then the next one would advance one slot. Each one of these wheels would scramble up the connection between keys and lights, and the switch box would scramble up the connection between keys and lights, and every time you pressed a key, the scrambling would change because these rotors would turn. This was a great state-of-the-art system as of 1940. And the Germans built many, many thousands of these, and they used them for virtually all of their military communications. These machines are quite rare today. This one is in the National Cryptologic Museum, which is between Baltimore and Washington, and which I highly recommend if you get a chance to go there. It's on the edge of the grounds of the National Security Agency, which is the agency of the US government that is in charge of breaking other countries' codes and reading their messages while protecting ours. Anyway, so this Enigma machine was used by German forces during World War II. Unbeknownst to the Germans, in the 1930s, a group of Polish mathematicians led by this guy, Marian Rejewski, had broken the basic code that the Enigma machine used. This was an amazing feat of mathematical analysis that the Germans simply didn't believe could be done. But these mathematicians, by thinking very hard about the patterns and doing an awful lot of sophisticated analysis, figured out how to break this system. Later, during World War II, British mathematicians, led by Alan Turing, were able to advance what the Polish mathematicians had done to move from a state where they could do pencil and paper analysis to actually building big computers that could decode German messages in bulk. And this had a huge impact on the war. To give just one example, the Germans used these machines to transmit messages to their submarines, their U-boats, telling them where to hunt for Allied convoys. So the fact that the Allies could break these codes meant that they knew where the submarines were going to be hunting. And the Germans found at a crucial point in the war that all of a sudden they were having really terrible luck at catching the American convoys as they were carrying arms and troops across the Atlantic. And there are many stories about, as a result, actually, the head of the German Navy got suspicious that they were being too unlucky and changed the code, souped up the machine to add a fourth rotor to it, which meant that the Allies' code-breaking mechanisms no longer worked, but Turing and company pretty quickly broke the new code and resumed the ability to read German messages. When you read the histories of World War II, a lot of them were revised in around 1970, when it became clear how thoroughly the Allies had broken the Axis codes. You read histories of World War II written in, say, the 1950s, which say General so-and-so was a brilliant tactician. It was as if he knew what the enemy was going to do. You read the story, one of the best examples here is the Battle of Midway, the biggest naval battle in the Pacific War, where the history said Admiral Nimitz was a tactical genius. He set a trap for the Japanese. He guessed, he shrewdly intuited what their plan was going to be and set an ambush in just the right time and place, which led to the American Navy winning that battle and gaining a huge advantage in the Pacific War. It was almost as if Admiral Nimitz knew what the Japanese were going to do. Well, it turns out that, in fact, he did, that all of the Japanese naval codes had also been broken, mostly by one of the unsung heroes of the World War II, a guy named William Friedman, who came to work every day in a bathrobe and slippers, but managed to break the major Japanese codes. In the 1970s, as all of this became clear, a lot of the histories were rewritten, and many of the, especially American generals and admirals, were seen to be not quite as brilliant as they had previously been thought. By the way, at the end of World War II, the Allies captured a lot of German Enigma machines, and many of those were sold to Allied countries or given to Allied countries, and we didn't technically mention that we knew how to read the messages. All right, back to the modern day of cryptography. Cryptography is good not only for secret messages, but we use it for a lot of other things, some of them in everyday life. Let's consider the problem of keyless entry. Here you see on the right a picture of my car. My actual car looks a little more like a white minivan. But here you have my valuable car, and I have a key fob that I'm going to use to open it. Okay. So now let's consider, when I push the green button, something's going to get transmitted through the airwaves to a receiver that's in the car, and then if I pushed the button on my key fob, then the car should open. But if somebody else comes along and just sends a radio signal to my car, then I don't want the door to open. All right, so how would we actually do that? Well, here's one way. Here's a simple but bad solution. The simple but bad solution, over here on the left, I have the key fob. Over here on the right, I have the car. Notice this looks kind of like the Alice and Bob picture. Key fob is like Alice and the car is like Bob, only the message is I'm really Alice, please open the door. And in fact, you can just do this. You can, one approach that will get the door open is to have the key fob send a message that says, open the door. And that works fine, but you could probably figure out what's wrong with this procedure. Right? Anybody can send that message, open the door. And that poses a number of problems. First of all, a malicious person can do it. But second of all, there are a lot of people with yellow sports cars. And if they all have the same key fob, then they can open my door as well. Right? We see this problem with garage door openers, at least we used to, where somebody's garage door opener would open their neighbor's garage just by accident. Right? So this isn't so great, because there's nothing secret about this. Anyone can send this message. Okay, so here's a better method. Let's try adding a secret. Now we're going to have a secret, like a secret key. In this case, it'll be the number 8295, which both the key fob and the car know. And we're going to try to use this secret to ensure that the car can tell the difference between the real key fob and an imposter, or just, a well-intentioned neighbor. So here's what we're going to do. The key fob's going to send a message that says, open the door, the secret's 8295. Okay, now the car can look at this and say, yeah, 8295 is the real value for the secret. I'm going to open. And this is actually better than our previous solution, but there's still something wrong with it, which is, sorry? It's just 4 digits. That's certainly one problem. Someone can just guess what the code is. We could make the code longer to deal with that. That might be a pain in the neck. It might make it less reliable, more expensive or something. But that's certainly one problem, but there's another problem as well. It can be detected, right. That is that if somebody is sitting nearby with an antenna, they can observe what gets sent from this key fob. They can basically record it and then play it back later. And when they play it back later, even if they don't even understand, even if this is written in French or Spanish or any language at all, all they have to know is that if they send what I sent, the door will open. This is the way actually some garage door openers work and some key fobs. This is not so great because of what we call a replay attack. Somebody can record and replay what was sent initially. Okay, so can we do better than that? Well, here is what we call a challenge response solution, which is somewhat better, a slightly more sophisticated method. So it works like this. The key fob sends to the car a message that says, open the door, I know the key. The car then doesn't believe it. The car then rolls some dice, well, not real dice, but sort of conceptually generates a random number and sends back what we call a challenge. Oh, yeah? Then, if you know the key, then surely you can encrypt this number, 6325, which was the result of the die roll. Well, so the key fob then takes this number 6325 and it encrypts it using the 8295, this secret, as a key, and some number comes out. And it sends the result back. It says the result of encrypting 6325 with the secret key is 9941. Right? The car then checks that that answer is right. It does the same encryption. It takes the same number it sent, 6325, encrypts it with the secret key, which it thinks is the same, and it gets a result. It compares those, and if they're the same, then it knows that the key fob did this encryption correctly, and it knows also that the key fob could not have done that encryption correctly unless it knew the key. Therefore, it knows that this message came from the genuine key fob. Now notice that this method is not susceptible to this replay problem. The reason being that if somebody records all of this and comes along later and tries to open my car door, they can say, open, I know the key. Then the car will roll dice again, and it will almost surely get a different number than 6325. A different challenge will be sent. Therefore, the answer to this encryption will be different. So next time you try to open my car, you'd better be able to encrypt again. So we say in the lingo of cryptography that this value 6325 is fresh. That means it was just generated and nobody could have known until just now what it was going to be. And it's never been seen before. Let's assume that we do this less than 10,000 times. And because this is fresh, then this answer could not have been old. If this is fresh, then the correct answer also has to have been freshly generated, meaning that this can't be a replay of an old interaction. So this method protects you against replay attacks. That's pretty good. Okay, But it turns out that there are problems with this too. And these problems get a little bit more practical. On the one hand, it's relatively easy to have one-way communication between a key fob to a car. Turns out it's a pain in the neck for various practical engineering reasons to send messages back and to sequence the messages in this kind of conversation. One-way communication and having only a single message like we did before is a lot easier on the engineers. It means, for example, that you don't need to have a sizable antenna in the key fob. It means that the key fob uses less energy, therefore the batteries run out less often. So for a lot of practical reasons, we don't want to send back and forth. Well, there's other things you can do. You can have the key fob have a sort of counter in it, which counts upward 1, 2, 3, 4, and every time you encrypt the next number in the sequence and send it across. And then the car has a counter in it that's synchronized, and so it knows which value is going to be encrypted next. And that works pretty well. There's only one message going forward. That's good. But there's a problem. What if I press the button while I'm not next to the car? Now the counter in my key fob is counting forward. The counter in my car is not. They get out of sync. This, by the way, this sort of counter method is the way most garage door openers work. There's a counter in the remote where you press the button. There's a counter in the opener that's on the roof of your garage. And they try to stay in sync. And the problem is if you press the button when you're not close enough to the house, or your kid presses the button 8 times while you're driving or something, then the two get out of sync and you have a problem. That's a pain in the neck. How do you get out of that? Well, you have some, well, all right. I've gone on long enough about this problem. I hope I've convinced you that it's not easy. And that the application of cryptography to even a pretty simple problem, like designing a key fob, can get subtle. We get caught up in methods, in questions like what happens if somebody records the interaction and replays it. We get caught up in questions like, is this key large enough or is it guessable? We get caught up in questions like, can we actually generate random numbers that are really fresh and sort of generated correctly? Because we can't build actual little dice into the car. And we get caught up in questions about whether it's efficient to have 3 messages versus 1 and one-way communication versus 2. This is why cryptographers get paid the big bucks. Okay. There are lots of other uses of cryptography. I've talked about the use of cryptography to transmit secret messages. That's kind of the classic use. I've talked about the use of cryptography to open a door as a sort of substitute for a kind of key that you can use at a distance. By the way, lots of keys that we use that are electronic, including the ones that we use to open the doors in buildings here at Princeton, are not as sophisticated as any of this. But anyway, there are lots of uses for cryptography. More and more, the more we try to do complicated interactions online, the more we find new uses for cryptography and new problems to solve, new problems for researchers, and more lectures for me to give in my cryptography class. So here's just a bunch of examples. Storing data securely. Suppose you have some private data that you're going to store on your laptop or you're going to store on your cell phone. Problem is, you worry that you might lose that phone or lose that laptop. Hundreds of thousands of laptops actually go missing at US airport checkpoints alone every year. And this has been a big problem. You read stories in the newspaper about some company, about some government agency that's lost private information about large numbers of people because some laptop went missing. Right? You'd like to store that data in a secure way so that if somebody gets their hands on the laptop, they can't just read all that private data. So you can use encryption. It's like a secret message, except instead of sending that message from Alice to Bob, Alice today is sending that message to Alice tomorrow. She encrypts the message, stores it on the computer, and then tomorrow when she comes back to use that data again, she can decrypt. So it's a message sent through time instead of across space. And there's lots of interesting problems about storing data securely. Authenticating people. That's a good example. When you go to a website and you're going to log in, you typically will give a password. And a password is like a kind of secret key. And what actually happens, or at least should happen, is that there is some encryption going on or some cryptographic operations involving that password. So that you, much like this challenge response protocol, so that you can prove to the website or whatever it is you're logging into that you really know the password, but without just blurting out the password in a way that someone else could hear it. Authenticating data, subtly different. You can't ask data information. How do you know that the information that you get from somewhere is genuine? How do you know that it hasn't been tampered with? How do you know that this letter was actually sent by me? How does Bob know that the message was actually sent by Alice and actually sent today? And unlike a person who you can ask to remember something, like, say, a password, or to have some attribute, like, say, a fingerprint, data just kind of lays there. And so authenticating it is a different kind of problem. Digital signatures are an interesting example. This is an analog to a physical signature like you might put on a contract or a document. You sign your name at the bottom, and in principle, that is supposed to be secure against forgery, and it's supposed to designate that you have agreed in a sort of formal legal way that you have agreed to that document. Well, there's a digital signature is like an equivalent of that that uses cryptography, where I can do something on my computer which puts a kind of stamp that sits next to, say, a legal contract, and then send that as an email to someone, and they can verify that it's real and that it actually came from me. Digital contracts, a similar way. If you can sign things, it's a small step to actually make agreements and to ensure that they happen in various ways. Sealed bids, all kinds of economic transactions can be moved into the electronic world by using cryptography to make sure that people are playing by the rules. Okay, so cryptography and many, many, many more. Cryptography has tons of uses. Almost any interesting interaction where everyone isn't fully trusted, read almost every interesting interaction, period, will involve cryptography if you want to do it safely in the online world. Okay, so I need to confess now that I kind of put one over on you a little bit earlier in this lecture. That I talked about what an encryption function was, and I talked about what it meant for an encryption function to be secure. If you remember, it means that somebody who sees the messages can't figure out, someone who sees a message but doesn't know the key can't figure out what the real message was, and that someone who sees the function in operation can't figure out what the key is. And then I talked about, all the great things we do in cryptography. But I kind of skipped over one question. How strong is the encryption that we actually use? Because we do use encryption every day when we use computers, when we use cell phones, and so on. So the first question we might ask is, are the encryption functions that we actually use on our computers every day strong? And what I mean by strong is what I said before. So this question is, can we prove that the methods that we actually use to encrypt our messages actually have the security properties that we rely on them to have? The answer is, we don't know. We just don't know. We're in the position, frankly, that the German Navy was with the Enigma machine. It looked pretty good, looks pretty good to us. None of us have figured out any way of defeating these functions. Nobody has figured out any way to work around these functions that we actually use. But on the other hand, we don't have any proof or even, frankly, a very convincing principled argument that these functions actually do have the properties that we want. We just haven't figured out yet that they don't. What that means is that the entire edifice of modern cryptography could just come crashing down tomorrow. All of the functions that we use, all the functions that the banks use to decrypt all of their private data, the stuff that we use to keep track of everything, that could all just be broken tomorrow. It could happen. I would bet very strongly against it being broken tomorrow. But it could happen because we just don't know. And that's not so great. Now, there is a little bit of good news here. And the good news is that a lot of very, very smart people are working on trying to break these functions. And that's good because we hope that if they are breakable, that the good guys will figure that out first and tell us, rather than the bad guys figuring it out first. It also has proven to be the case historically that these sorts of mathematically based methods don't just suddenly fall over dead. What has tended to happen is that mathematicians start to get hints that something is wrong. There start to be some sort of cracks in the edifice. There are, let's say, ways of defeating a method that kind of work in theory but not in practice. And then there are ones that are a little closer to being practical, and then ones that are a little closer yet to being practical. So we kind of get some warning that something is going to, that some cryptographic operation that we're that we rely on is likely to have problems. At least that's been the case so far, but who knows what might happen tomorrow. Okay, are strong encryption functions even possible? That's the next question. The answer is similarly unsatisfying. We just don't know. We strongly suspect that it is possible in this universe to have a strong encryption function, which no clever mathematician will be able to break. But we just don't know. This is one of the major open questions in theoretical computer science. Is strong cryptography even possible? We don't know. We would sure like to know. And anyone who figures out the answer to this question one way or the other will be very famous very quickly. All right, so we live in a world of uncertainty. Not only do we have uncertainty about whether the systems that we actually rely on will operate according to the principles of their design. In other words, we don't know that there's not some horrible engineering error in the way our, say, phone was built, which, even though the cryptography is sound, causes them to just sort of randomly blurt out secret information. And by the way, there are great stories about this as well. So we don't know whether they're sound on an engineering basis. We don't know whether the functions that we actually use actually are secure. And in fact, we don't know whether it's even worth trying. Nonetheless, we have to actually live in this world. Okay, so what do we do to cope with this? Well, our encryption function might be broken tomorrow. How do we protect ourselves? Well, there's still things we can do. We can stick with established functions. That is, we can stick with the methods that have stood the test of time. Even though they might fall over tomorrow, the fact that the methods that we actually use have been vetted for years and years by very, very smart people who have a lot to gain by breaking them, and they haven't succeeded, at least as far as we know, that's some evidence that they're less likely to be broken tomorrow. Stick with well-studied methods, and to avoid things that are new or proprietary. So one of the things that we've learned, if anything, in cryptography is that if some company comes along and says, we've got the greatest new method of cryptography that you're just going to love, the experts all say, whoa, don't give me anything new. Let's do it the way that we've been doing it for 25 years that nobody has defeated. Okay. Now, the functions, the methods, the cryptographic methods that are used by reputable products are usually very safe. So this, in practice, although it's theoretically terrifying, in practice, this is actually not our biggest problem when it comes to putting cryptography into practice. Our biggest problems are these. So let me talk about why systems actually do fail in practice most of the time. And these are sort of less a Mr. Wizard and more James Bond, or maybe Austin Powers. So why systems really fail? Reason number one, a trusted person misbehaves. We send our computer into the repair shop, or the IT person comes to fix it, and turns out that they're misbehaving. Somebody who we trust, who has access to our secrets, who has access to what our key is, who can change the way things work, actually turns out not to be so trustworthy. This happens all the time. Of course, in the financial world, this of course happens all the time. One of the important modes by which money is stolen is some trusted person just takes it. And the same thing happens with electronic secrets. A device is lost or stolen. I can have perfect encryption for communicating my email between my cell phone and the server here at the university. But if this phone is lost, well, my email is stored on it. And so that secure connection between this phone and the university's mail server is not going to help me if somebody has this, if the device is lost or stolen. Even if my email is not stored on my phone, probably I typed my email password into the phone, and it's remembering it as a convenience to me, so I don't have to keep typing it. So if someone finds this phone, even if it's got no data, if it knows my password, I'm in trouble. So a lost or stolen device. These devices are getting smaller and cheaper all the time, which means they're more likely to be lost or stolen. The key gets divulged to the wrong person. There are lots of ways that this can happen, but one of the most common ways is somebody just calling and begging. Calling up and asking. So the classic story here is that somebody calls up the CEO's secretary and says, "You've got to help me. The CEO is coming here to give the big presentation. I'm supposed to set up his laptop. and I've forgotten what his password is. He's going to fire me if he finds out that it's not ready when I get here. You know how he is. Please help me. Right? That pitch might well work. And in fact, one of the most notorious computer hackers of recent years, Kevin Mitnick, basically got his reputation as a super hacker by basically using a trick like that over and over again. Just creating a situation, creating the theatrics of a person in trouble who actually had a right to know the information, and someone just telling him over the phone what the password was. The keys being divulged to the wrong person. Happens all the time. This, by the way, is also a problem for another form of cryptography, namely the bank ATM machine. The PIN number that you typed in is a kind of secret key. And there have been problems in various places about people setting up fake ATMs. They set up a fake ATM, you happily put in your card, type your PIN, and it says, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do the transaction now, and spits your card back out, and you're in trouble because you just told your secret key to the wrong person. Corruption at the factory. Here's another problem. Often, secret keys are built into devices. Think your keyless entry fob for your car, right? Or for your garage door opener. Those were built in at the factory generally. The key is built right in. So if somebody at the factory is not so honest, they might do something that makes it easier for them to break in. They might, for example, make a copy of the key for your fob. They might make a copy of the PIN number that goes with your ATM card. They might cause all of the keyless entry fobs made by their factory to use one of 4 different codes, so they can just try all of those. Corruption at the factory actually is one of the ways that things fail. The device is used wrong due to a bad user interface. If the device is designed perfectly, you might type in your code, you might enter your code in the wrong way, you might leave it laying around in a place that's not safe because it seems okay to you because the device is engineered in a way that doesn't help you use it in a safe way. This happens all the time. This happens, for example, for people typing their passwords into the wrong box on the wrong web page. Here, in fact, is one of the biggest problems. The security mechanism is just ignored or turned off. There's a big red warning light that says, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. Or because there are too many warning lights that are false alarms, you just turn it off. This sort of thing happens all the time as well. So the reasons why systems fail most often in practice are things like this. Cryptography gives you a baseline of protection, and in theory, you have potential weaknesses or problems, but in practice, systems often fail for reasons like this. And this, again, gives me lots of reasons to give more lectures in my computer security class, as well as full employment for security consultants. It's actually hard to protect these things. Okay, so how can we cope with this insecurity? Well, there's a bunch of things we can do. We can't completely eliminate these risks. We can't eliminate the sort of risk of evil genius mathematicians breaking our cryptography, nor the risk of this sort of more petty corruption and accident that I talked about on the previous slide. But there are some things we can do to manage these risks, like with any risk we face. We can reduce our exposure. If a system is not entirely safe, maybe we want to think carefully about what information we give to it, how much money we entrust to a system. We can buy insurance. This is one of the classic ways of dealing with risk. If a disaster is unlikely but catastrophic, if it does happen, then insurance is a way for people to share the risk. We don't yet know how to insure well against these sorts of failures, at least for ordinary people. I think large institutions, financial institutions, have done a better job at figuring out how to get insured against these things. But insurance is certainly one of the ways we can spread and manage the risk. And not only does insurance spread the risk, but it also creates a single entity, namely the insurance company, that gets a lot of information about what goes wrong and why. And that's helpful. Learning from experience, hugely important. As people get accustomed to operating online, they get a sense for what's safe, what's not safe. You might make a mistake and learn something. Your friend might make a mistake and learn something. Somebody else might make a mistake and you read about it in the newspaper. All of this is helpful. Time-tested practices, also very useful. We have learned some things about how to behave online, but there's a lot of wisdom about how to behave offline that's also perfectly useful. Basic pieces of advice like in an unfamiliar place, don't give off signs that you have money. can be applied perfectly well online. There are things you can do that signal that you're a juicy target. Maybe you shouldn't do them. And in the end, accepting some risks as part of life. What cryptography and these methods can give us is a baseline of protection. They can give us the level of protection that we get from doors and locks and guards and ID cards and so on. But as we know, those systems themselves aren't perfect. Only when they're built into a larger social fabric of different kinds of defenses and ways of dealing with the risk and so on will we really be safe. And we're still learning in the online world how to do that. Thanks. I'll be happy to take questions. Over here.
In some of the spy movies, you see the agent transmitting something in a burst, very, very fast.
Yes.
Why is that safe?
Why? Well, there's different reasons for this, and actually Vince probably knows this better than I do. And some of them have to do with keeping the information secret. It might be harder. Oh, I'm sorry, let me repeat the question. The question is, in spy movies, sometimes the agent will transmit information in a really fast burst. Why is that? And there's a bunch of reasons it could be. One of them is sometimes what your goal is not so much to keep the message secret, or maybe in addition to keeping the message secret, keeping somebody from knowing who's communicating or where the people are. Right? If you're transmitting on a radio, you are giving an adversary the ability to localize where you are. And maybe if you send in a very fast burst and you're changing the frequency that you're broadcasting on rapidly during that burst, it might be harder for someone to figure out where you are or to detect that there is communication going on. Right? So also in spy movies, there's sort of this story about using antennas to sort of triangulate and figure out where someone is so you can send the SWAT team to arrive just in time. So they might be trying to avoid that. Sometimes the fact of communication is what you want to keep secret. That's true in a lot of military settings as well. You can imagine a stealth bomber that's flying somewhere. They don't want to just get on the radio and talk using a regular radio because that's going to be detectable to someone on the ground. They need to have some better way of communicating. So those could be the reasons. It also could be that that you're just trying to make it harder for someone to pick up what your encrypted message is, making them have more specialized equipment in order to receive. In the middle here.
I think in the mid-1950s and 60s, the military was kind of at the cutting edge of cryptography.
Yes.
I'm curious today whether the private industry is really overtaking that, as well as which markets, which other countries would you say are driving the level of expertise that we should be concerned about or try to buy?
Okay. So, right, the first question was about sort of, is the military in the past was ahead of the civilian sector in cryptography. Is that still the case? And the second one was about what countries or regions are leaders in cryptographic technologies that we might want to pay attention to or possibly buy. So the first one about the relationship between military cryptography and civilian cryptography. It was certainly true up until, say, maybe the 1970s, that the military was clearly ahead of the civilian sector in cryptography. It was a little bit hard to tell because, of course, the military doesn't tell us everything they know about cryptography. And let me tell you a story to illustrate that. Up until a couple years ago, the cryptographic function that almost everybody used was called DES, the Data Encryption Standard, which was promulgated by the US government in 1978. And DES was designed by a committee of cryptographers who were, many of whom were affiliated with IBM. So it was known at the time that the National Security Agency, which is the government's, the US government's cryptography experts, had whispered something in the ear of the designers of DES. And that there were parts of the DES design that the designers, the civilian designers, were not explaining to the rest of us. So that led to various conspiracy theories, right? They're putting a backdoor in so that the government can eavesdrop on what we do. And certainly to the extent that other countries might adopt our technology, it could be a great thing that the US government can listen to their communications. We later found out that, in fact, that the government had ways of breaking cryptographic systems that the civilian world hadn't figured out. And what the whispering was you need to do this. Otherwise, the system will be vulnerable to an attack you guys haven't figured out yet. So in that respect, at that time, the mid-'70s, the government was ahead. But the '70s were really the time when cryptography started to become important in the civilian world. As computer networks became more important, as more and more commercial and personal communication started to get done, suddenly the civilian world was interested in crypto. And suddenly, by today, the vast majority of the people and institutions that are interested in cryptography are civilian. And I would say that in many respects, the civilian world is ahead of the military world today. We can't say for sure, of course, because the military doesn't just publish all of its secrets. And they could tell you if you could get the clearance, but they could tell me if I could get the clearance, but then I couldn't tell you anyway. So we don't know for sure. One thing I think is true, though, is that the government and military world is better at the nuts and bolts of building systems so that they're less likely to leak information in other ways. So on the one hand, you have the cryptography of sort of what is the system supposed to do. On the other hand, you have the sort of way you wire it up and what goes next to what. Again, let me give you an example here, which is maybe a little bit interesting. I told the stories about World War II and the US and allies being able to break essentially all of the German and Japanese codes. In fact, during the Cold War, the US was also very successful at breaking many of the Russian Soviet codes. And even when they couldn't break the code, they were often able to do other things. One of the classic stories here is that the National Security Agency was listening in on some Soviet communications, and they noticed an odd thing, that although the main signal was unintelligible to them, there was this very faint signal kind of mixed in, which turned out to be the plain text of the message. Why was that? Well, inside the encryption machine, there was some circuitry over here which had the plain text, and then there was some stuff in between, and then there was the circuitry over here that was broadcasting the ciphertext. Well, it turns out when you put two wires parallel and kind of close to each other, they act as antennas, and there's a very weak signal that got broadcast as radio inside that encryption machine, so that a little tiny bit of the plain text got into the ciphertext. And so they ignored the loud ciphertext and just listened to the very faint plain text. Right? So when you're designing a system that encrypts, you need to make sure not to do that. And it's hard, right? Because these systems have a lot of wires in them. And you want to make them small, right? You have two wires inside my iPhone. They're not going to be far apart. So what do? Well, it turns out there's a lot of fancy engineering you need to do to keep that from happening. The military is better at that kind of stuff than the civilian world. That's pretty clear. And that stuff matters a lot in super high security settings. So if what you want is sort of high-end, ultra-secure stuff, well-engineered to not fail in these sort of quirky ways, the military, I think, is going to be clearly better at that. If what you want is kind of consumer-grade cryptography, I think the civilian world is ahead probably at that. And there's an interesting dynamic going on right now in which the security of civilian systems is becoming a significant national security issue for the United States. Meaning that ways of getting that knowledge out into the civilian world would help protect our civilian infrastructure from attack. On the other hand, if all of this great protective technology is something that can be that's built into every laptop, every cell phone, then our adversaries can buy it too. So there still will be cases and ways in which the military is ahead, I think. So that's a long answer to the first part of your question. The second part is about was about countries or regions that are ahead in cryptography. And the short answer is any country that's good in math probably is good in cryptography. The US is clearly one of the leaders, if not the leader in this area. Countries with large and Traditional scientific apparatuses are also tend to do well. Britain, France, Russia to a lesser extent. Israel has a particularly strong cryptographic, has a particularly strong body of cryptographic expertise. This is something that, given the strength of their mathematics community as well as the emphasis on national security that they have faced, they've developed very strong cryptographic systems. Researchers and people in industry in a lot of these countries will talk to each other, and people will cross borders, and so on. So there's not so much a rivalry between friendly countries so much as a sort of shared community of people who design things. China? China certainly, China is, as in many things, China is gearing up for bigger efforts. I would say China is not yet one of the leaders in this field. I think they are likely to become one for all the same reasons why that they're in many ways gaining on us. I'm still hopeful, actually, that the U.S. will continue to probably be the leader in this area for quite a while. We have a lot of advantages, and it turns out that in cryptography, as in other areas, there's the formal written down knowledge that is important, but there's also a lot of tacit knowledge about how to do things. And the tacit knowledge builds up within your community over time. The other huge advantage that the U.S. has is that our government is better at this than anybody else, I think by far. Ever since, starting really around World War II, the U.S. government has really run rings around other countries' governments in doing, not only in designing systems well, but in consistently being able to break and defeat other countries' systems. So I think, and that expertise, although there's not an easy barrier for it to flow out of the government, I think it does flow gradually. And the sort of tacit knowledge from that community is useful. So I still think the U.S. will be leader for years to come.
I have a question about the security of online voting.
Yes.
At least for 10 years, corporations have been exercising their votes online and apparently pretty securely. But yet we don't see voting for political reasons online. Is there theoretical problems about doing political voting online?
Okay. And so the question is about online voting. We see corporations, for example, stockholder elections to elect the board and so on, being done online. But we don't see that happening for political elections. Why not? I think there are several reasons. One is that, frankly, political elections are much more likely to be seriously contested than many stockholder elections. And if the election's not seriously contested, then the stakes are kind of low. The other thing is, I think, that people tend to place more value on the secret ballot in political elections. And the secret ballot is one of the things that makes doing secure elections really hard. Because if you think about it, what you want in securing an election is to know that the vote you cast was really counted. And that's difficult when we can't give you a receipt. Right? If you think about the way, say, an automatic teller machine works, you go and you do the transaction, it's all electronic and so on, but they give you a receipt, they take your picture, they keep a paper receipt and electronic receipt that says Ed Felten on a particular time and date withdrew this many dollars at this machine. In electronic voting, you can't keep that kind of record. And that makes it really hard to secure the transaction. And it seems to be much more, the secret ballot seems to be much more sensitive in an online setting. And there's some very basic issues with the secret ballot with online voting. One of them being, how do you know that the person is actually alone? In a real world, in a physical election where you go to the polling place, we make you go into a booth alone. And everybody watches that you go in there alone. Maybe you bring in your little kid, but otherwise you're by yourself. And that's an important safeguard to protect you against vote buying and coercion of various forms. If you're voting online, if I'm voting online on my laptop, you really don't know whether someone is standing there with the $100 bill in their hand watching me vote, or someone is watching me and saying, if you don't vote the way I want, something bad will happen. It's pretty hard in an online setting to protect the secret ballot in that way. That's, I think, part of the reason. And whether the rules require secret ballot or not in shareholder elections, in practice, people don't treat it as that sensitive an issue. To me, that's one of the big differences. Also, I think that the stakes are sometimes higher in a political election. Yes?
There are a lot of hackers around,
Mm-hmm.
and there are always attempts by the software companies to enhance their software so that the hackers can't get at it. Does that make it fewer and fewer hackers with time, with more and more skill, or are the hackers able to keep up with what's going on in the software?
So the question is, well, there are that software companies are constantly working to improve their products. Does that mean that there are getting to be fewer and fewer hackers over time? Are the hackers falling behind? Unfortunately, I think they're not. We basically have in the security of big software systems, there's basically an equilibrium between two things that are happening. One of the things that's happening is that the systems are getting bigger and more complicated, having more features. You can think of that as the system gets bigger, there's like a bigger surface. If you're trying to protect your land, right, the more land you have, the bigger, longer your fence has to be, and the harder it is to defend. The more places there could be a failure. So we see this increase in complexity, and that is a problem because it means inherently more errors. The error rate in software is fairly predictable. That is one serious security bug per so and so many lines of code, generally in a software product, even if you use the best engineering methods. So that tends to increase the number of flaws. On the other hand, software companies are working like crazy and using ever more advanced methods to try to prevent or, after the fact, find these sorts of problems. And that's the other factor, which is counteracting it. And it's a sort of equilibrium between getting more bugs because the system's growing and having fewer because of the security efforts. And we seem to be in an equilibrium. And if you think about it, it's maybe not that surprising. There's a classic factoid about anti-lock brakes. So you remember when cars got anti-lock brakes, right? The story was, this is great, we'll have fewer accidents. Well, in fact, what happened is people said, great, I've got anti-lock brakes, now I can drive faster. I can tailgate more closely because I can stop faster. So people took that benefit of safety and they traded it for convenience, right? Instead of having fewer accidents, we now get to our destinations a little faster. And that's good, right? It's good to get to your destination faster. But what happened is people traded away safety in order to get convenience. And that, I think, is what happens with software. We get more safety because the companies get better at preventing bugs, but we trade that away for more convenience in having a product that's larger and has more features and does more things. So we're stuck in an equilibrium where the rate of risk doesn't really change. And the bad guys are still there and have plenty of opportunity for success. Law enforcement is working hard to contain that problem and sort of keep it within bounds. And I think the long-term equilibrium is it's going to be like other forms of especially petty crime. It'll be an annoyance, but it will be kept within bounds, bounds that we can live with on an everyday basis.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.